one other thing that's happening is evictions, even during this pandemic, and it's really gotten no attention, especially as congressional lawmakers continue to negotiate a relief package. Where they stand with the negotiations is shameful in a number of different ways, but when it comes to the issue of evictions, it's particularly bad. So let's talk a little bit about that. So there's a looming eviction crisis, and based how relief package negotiations are taking place among congressional lawmakers, it doesn't seem like they plan on doing much about it. Now, the CDC's eviction moratorium will expire on December 31st, which will lead to an explosion of Americans being forced out of their homes and onto the streets. And Congress is having a discussion about maybe we should extend this moratorium. But even that's not enough. So just to give you a sense of the weight of this issue, 6.7 million adults are likely to face eviction or foreclosure in the next 2 months. And you see actual instances of people being evicted even now during this so-called moratorium when people are supposed to be housed in order to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. But again, just let me reiterate, that moratorium isn't enough. Here's what the scene looked like in Brooklyn on December 11th when a tenant activist tried to block the NYPD from evicting a family from their home. Take a look.
Y'all interesting? You lie down in bed at night and sleep well? Fuck y'all! People are dying on the street! Fuck y'all!
And it didn't stop there. In fact, just last night, there was yet another protest, and New York State Assembly member Desmond Meeks was arrested for being there to witness what was going on. He was filming it, documenting it. The cops were there to try to evict a mother and her children, a single mother and her children. And of course, the weather is pretty cold and awful in New York right now. And here's what happened when cops confronted Meeks.
This is what we see. This is an eviction of RPD about to put a single mother and her children out on the streets. This is Assembly Member Demond Meeks. I'm under arrest. I'm under arrest for coming out here and filming what's going on. Okay. I'm under arrest for what? I need my phone. Yo, you're breaking my glasses. You're breaking my glasses. I'm just here as a witness. I'm here witnessing what's going on. I just came here.
Hand behind your back.
Okay. Okay.
Don't resist.
I'm not resisting you, my name.
How are people getting evicted right now when there is a moratorium and when there are as many as 3,500 people dying every day from coronavirus? This pandemic is worse today than it was in the beginning of the pandemic. And in the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, at least there was some willingness for our lawmakers to take it seriously, to protect people, to ensure that people were housed, to ensure that there was something being done to provide some relief through robust unemployment benefits, through a direct check to Americans. But that's not the case right now. Clearly. And all we keep hearing about is that looming December 31st date. But again, Congress hasn't done enough. The CDC hasn't done enough. And when it comes to the more recent moratorium that was implemented by the CDC, the problem was that it was implemented and written in such a vague way that some states decided to interpret it in, let's just say, a way that isn't so generous to people in need. Take a look.
It's important to realize that the federal moratorium that's due to end wasn't good enough to begin with. It didn't come until September, and that was months after people in places like Kansas City had been evicted and forced to the streets in the middle of a global pandemic. The CDC moratorium only covers one type of eviction, and those are evictions for non-payment of rent. It leaves a lot open to local interpretation, and it puts the burden on tenants to apply for that protection. So the CDC moratorium was not good enough, but the CDC moratorium allowed to expire at the end of the month leaves hundreds of thousands, millions of families vulnerable to eviction within the first 20 days of the next year.
And she's absolutely right. I mean, in some places in this country, you even have federal judges who are hearing eviction cases and siding with landlords. One perfect example is Judge Patricia Kinsey from Florida, who has decided to consistently side with landlords. She sided with a lawyer for a tenant named Steve Crowley. She sided with a lawyer for tenant Steve Crowley's landlord, a big Canadian company that owns 19,000 rental units in North America, who'd argued that the CDC order was unconstitutional. In fact, she thought that this was horrible when it comes to private property. Agreeing with the landlord's lawyer, Kinsey ruled that the CDC moratorium represented an unlawful taking by the U.S. government of landlords' private property rental income. Oh no, I mean, we can't mess with private property. But to be sure, there is an issue with mom and pop landlords who literally rely on their rental property in order to pay their own bills. And to be quite honest with you, we haven't really seen much of an effort by Congress to handle that situation either. And look, even when the pandemic was, finally taken seriously and people were housed, because it was considered an important public health measure, the system still will value profits over human lives. So for instance, take a look at this tweet by Mike Baker, where he mentions that there's been another record. More than 250,000 new coronavirus infections were identified in the United States today. This was a tweet that he put out there on December 18th. Over the past month, about 5.9 million new infections have been identified. That's 1 out of every 56 people in the nation. Now, I give you that statistic because it's important to understand how this virus is just tearing through the country. It continues to be a gigantic public health concern. Yet, people are being unhoused already, even before the moratorium is lifted, and Congress has failed, as of now, as we do this story, has failed to come up with a robust relief package that really addresses these issues. But even a robust, foolproof moratorium isn't enough. And I want to make the case for that because all it really does is provide a temporary bandage on something that was a gushing wound even before the pandemic. Unaffordable housing, homelessness, these issues existed before coronavirus started to tear through the country. And remember, the eviction moratorium isn't the same as rent cancellation or mortgage cancellation. All it does is kick the can down the road, and Americans are still going to owe thousands of dollars in back rent. So for Americans who did find some protection under the CDC's moratorium, understand that once it eventually expires, and we know it eventually will, their landlords will try to evict them if they are unable to pay that back rent. The portion of tenants owing back rent has roughly tripled during the pandemic, federal census surveys show. The most recent survey tracking the pandemic's impact on households identified an estimated 18% of households behind on rent payments. So what do you guys think that looks like? How bad is the problem? What does the average renter own as soon as these moratoriums are lifted? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia says renter households experiencing job loss because of COVID-19 currently at this moment owe an estimated $7.2 billion in unpaid rent, or $5,400 each. But don't expect the appropriate response from our congressional lawmakers, like, for instance, Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who literally had the balls to stand up and give this ridiculous speech this week.
When I came to the Senate, we were a little over $14 trillion. Our GDP was over $15 trillion. We're actually below 100% of GDP. Now, I know I'm using a lot of numbers right now, and I'm going to use more because that's part of the problem. And one of the reasons we are $27.4 trillion in debt is we only speak about need. We only talk in terms of compassion. We all have compassion. We all want to fulfill those needs. We just don't talk in numbers very often. We don't analyze the data. We don't take a look at what we did in the past and see, did it work?
I love looking at the past and trying to figure out whether some of the actions taken by congressional lawmakers have worked or failed. Now, of course, there have been a lot of failures, and I'd like to point to one that involved Republican Senator Ron Johnson. This is from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a headline that says U.S. Senator Ron Johnson backs tax cuts, dismisses $1 trillion projected increase in federal debt because they don't actually care about the debt. Do they love tax cuts? Of course they do. Do they love spending any of our resources on actually benefiting the American people, especially during a time of crisis? Of course not. And that's what that speech was really about. It was a giant middle finger to the American people who are truly suffering right now due to no fault of their own. A virus that they couldn't have predicted, a virus that has led to tens of millions of Americans losing their jobs, a virus that has led to more than 300,000 Americans dying. And Ron Johnson stands up there and pretends like he cares about the debt. It's absolutely shameful. And there's virtually no aid for independent mom and pop landlords who, again, do rely on rental property income in order to pay their own bills. And so they're still responsible for paying utilities for their buildings. They're still responsible to pay their property taxes. And some of you might think, no, landlord's bad. Doesn't matter if they're corporate landlords or independent mom and pop landlords. But understand that this has created a situation in which the worst corporations are snatching up these buildings and just continuing to increase the rent. So I'll give you a perfect example, and this was written by David Sirota for the Daily Poster. Please read the full piece because it's fantastic. So at the Goldman Sachs Financial Services Conference on December 9th, Blackstone's billionaire CEO, Steven Schwartzman, boasted that after the 2008 financial crisis, his firm was able to cash in on the mortgage crisis. At the time, the company was able to buy up foreclosed homes and convert them into rental properties, subsequently plagued by the accusations of dilapidation or excessive fees, all while it received a big financial boost from the government. And guess what? Blackstone is really excited about these independent landlords who have become desperate because they're not getting any aid from the government. They're not able to collect rental income for obvious reasons. And so they're either putting their buildings on the market, which then gets snatched up by people like Schwartzman, or they're being foreclosed on. And so it's going to create a far worse situation for renters down the line, and Congress doesn't care. Congress isn't doing anything about it. As Schwartzman says, you always have winners and losers. Blackstone was a huge winner coming out of the global financial crisis, and I think something similar is going to happen. I bet he does. And by the way, wouldn't you know it, despite the country's devastation and public health crisis, Blackstone continues to force their own tenants out on the streets. As Sirota writes, Blackstone has also been evicting residents during the pandemic and has faced a legal showdown in New York, or with New York tenants, at one of the city's largest rental complexes, which it owns. There, the company has been trying to exempt thousands of units from rent regulation laws. The company has reportedly even kept Manhattan units empty rather than face rent control regulations. And I've certainly seen quite a bit of that here in Los Angeles as well. And look, if Senate Democrats want to actually do something about this, and to be sure, lawmakers like Senator Bernie Sanders they've been fighting pretty hard. But they can actually fight harder because, believe it or not, they do have leverage, even though Republicans control the Senate. What do I mean by that? Well, keep in mind that Mitch McConnell just recently admitted that Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, who are, running in the Senate runoff races in Georgia, are currently being hounded due to the lack of direct checks to Americans. Of course, this is part of the relief package negotiations, something that Mitch McConnell was not in favor of in any way at all. However, once he realized that this could hurt the chances of Loeffler and Perdue getting reelected, he jumped on a call with GOP lawmakers and urged them to send a direct check to Americans. Now, that's important because we know that Republicans don't want to lose control of the Senate. And so, since Democrats have that leverage, why not use it? There's also one other thing that's not getting a lot of attention. Turns out that Donald Trump wants, whether you believe him or not, he's on the record claiming that he wants a more robust relief package for Americans. Here's what he said to Brian Kilmeade in the past weekend.
What about an aid package for the American people?
Moving along.
What could you do to get the $900 billion out from
Well, I want
Nancy
to do
Pelosi and
it.
Mitch
I'm
McConnell?
pushing it very hard. And to be honest with you, if the Democrats really wanted to do the deal, they do the deal. They should do it right now. I want to see checks going for more money than they're talking about going to people.
Democrats should use that soundbite, and they should use it aggressively, and they should use that leverage against the Senate GOP, which of course has served as an obstacle in getting a robust relief package to Americans. But unfortunately, we do have a number of feckless, self-interested Democratic lawmakers, like Senator Warner, who is one of the wealthiest members of Congress. He's a Democrat, and in regard to what progressives have been demanding, he's gotten a little salty. And here's what he said on a recent interview with MSNBC.
I mean, we're dealing with a Senate that is still, unfortunately, controlled by the Republicans. We still have Donald Trump as president, controlling 2/3, in a sense, of the federal government, the executive and the Senate. And the alternative would have been to have people get kicked off of unemployment, get kicked out of their apartments, not get the kind of food assistance that's needed. The Republican deal was sitting at $500 billion. And frankly, there had not even been any conversations between leadership.
So he sounds like he's not really interested in fighting or using any of the leverage that Senate Democrats have in demanding more for the American people. I want to reiterate, the New York Times reported that McConnell said Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, who are both facing January runoffs that will determine which party controls the Senate, something very important for Republicans, right? We're getting hammered for Congress's failure to deliver more pandemic aid to struggling Americans, particularly the direct payments, and that enacting the measure could help them. I would dangle those Senate races right before them and, again, just flex your muscle, Democrats. Fight and do the right thing. But as I shared in a segment with you all last weekend, the truth is, when you have incredibly wealthy people allegedly representing us in Congress, they're so far disconnected from the realities that we face on a daily basis. They just don't get it. And so we get insulted with a proposal of a one-time $600 check, or maybe no check at all. But in this case, I think if Democrats understood the leverage they had and they were willing to fight a little harder, they could get something done to not only prevent people from getting evicted in a temporary period of time, but more importantly, provide actual rental assistance so people aren't kicked out of their home as soon as that moratorium is lifted. That hasn't been addressed. I don't know if it's going to be addressed, but it is a big problem that seems like no one's paying much attention to.
Yeah, I mean, it just added up to the myriad ways in which our political class, ruling class, has just completely left us in the lurch during this economic crisis fueled by the pandemic. I mean, it's weird because a lot of this stuff, obviously there's a ton of pain happening right now, but it's almost like the pandemic has frozen a lot of it, has frozen things in place. And it will only get much, there's a way in which it's going to get worse once everything kind of quote unquote goes back to normal. Because like you said, people are going to start collecting those checks that they're owed. It's going to create all kinds of chaos, both in the housing market, the commercial real estate market. All these things are just going to be in a very, very precarious place. And in just it's hard to imagine what's going to happen. I mean, there is such a deep and broad economic crisis that's happening right now that, again, like something, it's either going to we're either going to sort of emerge from this with some sort of big kind of New Deal type thing. And I'm not necessarily thinking that's going to happen right now or with this current Biden administration or whatever, but the country is really kind of at a major inflection point in which we're either going to come out of it with this big kind of 21st century New Deal, or just kind of fall into a permanent state of downward spiral, permanent crisis, and just kind of like a mass underclass that is just much bigger than it ever has been in our history. I mean, it really is wild to think about. You look at something like this and you look at just how absent it is from the chatter, the political conversation, the negotiations going on Capitol Hill, all of those things. And it boggles the mind. I mean, it really boggles the mind. And again, I just don't know what is going to come out of this. I mean, it's going to create a political instability unlike we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that at least in Los Angeles, you can already see the impact of what's going on. I mean, of course, we had a problem with homelessness even before the pandemic, but that problem has really exploded during this pandemic. And I mean, when it comes to local lawmakers, like, what have they done? Oh, let's put a porta potty underneath the bridge and that'll be good enough. No, but it's insane because that's actually what was tried back in, I think, the early 1990s. And it ended up being a massive failure because people were using the porta potties for drug trafficking and all sorts of other crime. And it did nothing to actually, help with any type of public health concern. During the AIDS epidemic, HIV epidemic, there were housing programs because the government realized that this is a public health issue, right? And it's better to keep people housed in a clean, safe place rather than have them, out on the streets, possibly, spreading this. But we don't have that kind of mindset right now in this country. Like, things are so far in this neoliberal profit-driven direction that we're having conversations about, okay, what more can we do to bail out these businesses? I'm not talking about small businesses, like these corporations. I mean, the Federal Reserve printing money, all of that is totally fine. But when it comes to sending direct checks to Americans who are in need right now, they're totally nickel and diming us. 8 million more Americans fell into poverty since the last summer. That's insane. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah. And I think more than anything, guys, what it shows me is just how the left has no power, because if we did, then we would be able to do something about this. Congress isn't afraid of us. No. They're not afraid of us at all. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and ultimately, anyway, I mean, the presence of 500,000 homeless people in the richest country in the world is just utterly, it's one of those things that I when I think about it, it drives me absolutely crazy. And yeah, I mean, ultimately our goal should be to decommodify the housing market pretty much entirely. I mean, it should not be something subject to the whims of the market. It just shows that the market cannot satisfy housing for all. I mean, it just can't. So again, decommodify the things that we need in our lives. That should be a principle that we stick to over and over again, whether it's food, housing, medical care, education. All those things need to be decommodified. Sure, we can have like for shoes and stuff, we can have companies competing with each other and things like that. But for the things that we actually need in our lives.
No, I totally agree with you. And when it comes to like rent control, for instance, I mean, it goes back to a very familiar theme on this show. You can try to regulate a privatized industry, right? But it's never going to be enough, because with rent control in LA, this pandemic has shown how weak rent control is. Because what ends up happening is, okay, these mom and pop landlords can't afford to keep paying property taxes and utilities and everything for these buildings for their tenants, and so they're putting this stuff back on the market, or they're being foreclosed on, which allows vultures like Schwartzman to come in and snatch them up. But understand what they do: they don't keep the rent-controlled buildings. What they do is they demolish them, and then they build these luxury condos or luxury apartment buildings that are overpriced, and they do sit empty. And it blows my mind. Like, that was a big problem even before the pandemic. And now this pandemic and the inaction by our lawmakers is putting that problem on overdrive. So we're going to really see this housing crisis explode in the next year. And Congress is just not up for the challenge at all. They don't care to do anything about it.